Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Federalist-Files. We're going to be going over Federalist number 75 today. It is titled The Treaty Making Power of the Executive, written by Alexander Hamilton, March 26th, 1788. Topics include treaties are of both a legislative and executive nature, two-thirds of the Senate present necessary to approve a treaty. So this one generally just goes over the executive papers in general aren't really that interesting. They go over all different things of the executive power because at this time the executive really didn't have much power. A lot of the power was held in the legislative branch, thus the reasoning for, I think it was like something like 20 papers we had on the legislative authority. So this one specifically kind of just goes through the idea of treaty making, the reasoning that there is an intermixture, I guess, if you will, of the powers because there's multiple powers being used. Thus, the reasoning for the making of the treaty being of the executive and the legislative authority. So in this paper, Hamilton, he defends the president's power to make treaties, provided two-thirds of the Senate concurs. This may be one of the least objectionable powers, and this is what Hamilton notes himself. He states, and I quote, "It is one of the best digested and most unexceptionable parts of the plan," end quote. So meaning that people really don't disagree with it. It's pretty balanced, it's pretty reasonable, and it's the big part that people disagree with. I think he actually states it. Okay, so yeah. So the objections include arguments on the grounds of an intermixture of powers and a dissension involving the necessary concurrence of the two-thirds of the senators that are present. Okay, so it's not two-thirds of the total body of the senators. It is two-thirds of the senators that show up for the adjudication. Rather than two-thirds, like I said, of the entire Senate. Because at this time there would be some sort of issues getting to the court. I think at that time they held everything at Independence Hall in Philly. So now it would be in D.C., obviously. It's not as difficult because, transportation is easily accessible, especially for these big wigs in Washington. They make a lot of money. They're going to have multiple forms of transportation. They're not going to have a problem getting there. So he starts the paper off, he states, and I quote, "I scruple not to declare my firm persuasion that is one of the best digested and most exceptionable parts of the plan. One ground of objection is the trite topic of the intermixture of powers. Some contending that the president ought alone to possess the power of making treaties, others that it ought to have been exclusively deposited in the Senate. Another source of objection is derived from the small number of persons by whom a treaty may be made. Of those who espouse this objection, a part are of opinion that the House of Representatives ought to have been associated in the business, while another part seem to think that nothing more was necessary than to have substituted two-thirds of all the members of the Senate rather than two-thirds of the members present." So there's a couple different things. The House of Representatives one is, to me, kind of a little insane. He goes over that one at the very end just because that's an ever-changing body of people. They're not going to be have as much expertise. They're not going to hold as much wisdom about the country. They're going to be of a younger age. And what was the other reason? There's much more stability in the Senate. So Hamilton, he dismantles the argument of intermixture of powers by citing a treaty that a treaty itself is similar to laws, which is of the legislative power and regulations as well, and the executive power is related to the execution of those laws, and that would kind of give distinction to the executive authority, because to enforce a treaty, that's the executive power's job, and then to make the treaty, to create the rule and the regulation of the treaty would be of the legislative discretion, which is what the reasoning for this provision having to do with the president as well as the legislative branch. They both hold a power in authorizing a treaty. So Hamilton next details, and I quote, "I venture to add that the particular nature of the power of making treaties indicates a peculiar propriety in that union. Though several writers on the subject of government place that power in the class of executive authorities, yet this is evidently an arbitrary disposition. For if we attend carefully to its operation, it will be found to partake more of the legislative than the executive character, though it does not seem strictly to fall within the definition of either of them. The essence of the legislative authority is to enact laws, or in other words, to prescribe rules for the regulation of the society, while the execution of the laws and the employment of the common strength, either for the purpose or for the common defense, seem to comprise all the functions of the executive magistrate. So yes, enforcing the laws, providing for the common defense, which actually is related to any type of treaty with a foreign nation who could be in the future a foreign adversary, is all of the executive power. The executive magistrate is in the president, and then the legislative authority, their job is to enact laws, to prescribe rules and regulations for the society, which that's what a treaty would be. Okay. Then he goes on next, and he does at one point point out a very important distinction, and here's where it is. He states, and I quote, "The power of making treaties is plainly neither the one nor the other. It relates neither to the execution of the subsisting laws nor to the enaction of new ones, and still less to an exertion of the common strength. Its objects are contracts with foreign nations, which have the force of law, but derive it from the obligations of good faith. They are not rules prescribed by the sovereign to the subject, but agreements between the sovereign and the sovereign." End quote. So what he means is, this actually, technically, if you really analyze this and look into this, they're making laws, but the law is an international law. It's a law between two different, and he says sovereigns, rather than, he doesn't use the term subjects. What they would say is subjects, or people that are subjected to that law, would be us, the people. So whenever the government makes the law, they say, these people are going to be subjected to following these rules or these laws. Whereas in this case, it is a sovereign, as in an opposing country, and a sovereign, as in our country, would get together and they would make this treaty. So if that's the case, then this power really is not of any legislative or executive discretion, because there aren't really that many laws in place, or the Constitution doesn't lay out what a treaty really, who holds the power to do that international affair type deal, which is the reasoning for giving that power to the Senate as well as the executive. Nowadays, we don't even really do treaties. We have like the Iran deal, which really wasn't a treaty. It never passed through the Senate. It's meaningless. The Paris Climate Accord, same thing, didn't pass through the Senate. It's meaningless. Like these treaties that we come out with now, these deals, these international deals, they circumvent what a treaty is supposed to be. It's kind of like being in the UN. If you guys want to impose some sort of rule or sanction on a country, or other countries, you guys want to make this giant pact and this giant deal, then you would have to vote that through the legislative branch as a treaty, and that just has not really happened yet. Paris Climate Accords, as well as the Iran deal, none of that stuff ever passed through, because it wouldn't have. You're not getting 2/3 to pass through in the Iran deal, 2/3 of the Senate to agree to hand over power to Iran and send them pallets of cash. It's just not going to happen. So next he states, and I quote, "However proper or safe it may be in governments where the executive magistrate is a hereditary monarch to commit to him the entire power of making treaties, it would be utterly unsafe and improper to entrust that power to an elective magistrate of 4 years' duration. It has been remarked upon another occasion, and the remark is unquestionably just, that a hereditary monarch, though often the oppressor of his people, has personally too much stake in the government to be in any material danger of being corrupted by foreign powers." End quote. So he's saying, most people will say this power should be laid only independently in the executive magistrate. And then he kind of relates it to the case of a hereditary monarch. Hereditary monarchs are actually going to always do the best thing for the country in a treaty-like situation, because the monarch's position of power is incumbent on the existence of the country. If the country is no longer there, then that hereditary monarch is no longer in power. Now, in this case, in the case of America, you have somebody that is a private citizen. They become the president, and they only serve at the goodwill of the people, and then they're no longer president at one time. So they're much more of a corruptible person than as crazy as it sounds, as a much more corruptible than a monarch, a hereditary monarch would be, because once again, it is reliant, that monarch, him having his position, is reliant on the country continuing to succeed and continuing its existence. Whereas with the president, after the person steps down, they're no longer president, the country's still going to go on. So Hamilton, he explains this. He states, and I quote, "But a man raised from the station of a private citizen to the rank of chief magistrate, possessed of a moderate or slender fortune, and looking forward to a period not very remote, when he may probably be obliged to return to the station from which he was taken, might sometimes be under temptations to sacrifice his duty to his interest, which it would require superlative virtue to withstand. An avaricious man might be tempted to betray the interests of the state to the acquisition of wealth. An ambitious man might make his own aggrandizement by the aid of a foreign power the price of his treachery to his constituents." End quote. So yes, his treachery, his constituents would suffer from it. It would be the president would do things out of personal greed for the acquisition of wealth, or maybe for his own aggrandizement. You're not really sure. I remember when I watched this Vikings show. I don't even know if it's bad. I know it's based on Vikings, but I don't know if they're actual Vikings. There was Ragnar, and then Ragnar's brother, I don't remember exactly what his name was, he went and he fought for the Franks. He fought for like the French army at the time. And then they were battling against each other. So it was kind of that kind of deal, because his brother was, I think, second in command at that time. Pretty much betrayed them. That could happen, and he betrayed them because he wanted money, he wanted power, or what have you. He wanted to be like the ruler over there in France. But yeah, that something like that would happen here is really what he's alluding to. So alternatively, Hamilton notes, and I quote, "To have entrusted the power of making treaties to the Senate alone would have been to relinquish the benefits of the constitutional agency of the president in the conduct of foreign negotiations." End quote. So you're saying if we just gave this, because then there's people that also say, well, why don't you just give all the power to the Senate and screw the president? And he said, well, can't really do that because it's also a constitutional agency of the president to conduct foreign negotiations as well. So there is some sort of power that the president has. We have that currently now. I think it's the Secretary of State deals with foreign affairs, foreign relations with other countries and other statesmen or government officials. So Hamilton next, he asserts, and I quote, It must indeed be clear to a demonstration that the joint possession of the power in question by the President and Senate would afford a greater prospect of security than the separate possession of it by either one of them." End quote. So yeah, that makes sense. You give an extra layer of security to the people. You have it go through the executive, and you also have it go through the Senate as well. Senators at that time elected by the state legislative branch, so they were kind of the representation of the people. It makes sense. So the president's consent works as an extra layer of security for the people, because the circumstances involved with the appointment of the president ensures that he will be of exceptional character, wisdom, and integrity, and that was because of the electors, the electoral college, the electoral system. So next, Hamilton, he alludes to the reasoning behind the exclusion of the House of Representatives, characterizing it, and I quote, "The remarks made in a former number, which have been alluded to in another part of this paper, will apply with conclusive force against the admission of the House of Representatives to a share in the formation of treaties. The fluctuating and taking its future increase into account, the multitudinous composition of that body forbid us to expect in it those qualities which are essential to the proper execution of such a trust. Accurate and comprehensive knowledge of foreign politics, a steady and systematic adherence to the same views, a nice and uniform sensibility to national character, decision, secrecy, and dispatch are incompatible with the genius of a body so variable and so numerous." End quote. So this is a pretty epic quote. Saying these people, they're not going to be wise enough, they're not going to hold the wisdom, they don't really understand the national character, they're not uniform because it's an ever-changing body, they only run 2-year terms, they're just not going to know as much about the issues as a senator would. They're not going to have much secrecy and dispatch, because it's like if you did actually tell a secret to a small group of people, usually you could keep that secret contained in that small group, whereas with with a larger group, you play the old telephone game, you're just not going to be able to hold that secret. So, in other words, the House of Representatives holds too much instability with a body so variable and numerous and is unable to effectively carry out such a power that is dependent on the national character as well as comprehensive knowledge of foreign politics. So the final objection to be answered is that of the 2/3 of members present rather than 2/3 of all members. So next, so Hamilton, he replies to this objection with the 2/3 of members present. He states, and I quote, "If 2/3 of the whole number of members had been required, it would in many cases from the non-attendance of a part amount in practice to a necessity of unanimity. And the history of every political establishment in which this principle has prevailed is a history of impotence, perplexity, and disorder. Proofs of this position might be adduced from the examples of the Roman tribuneship, the Polish Diet, and the States General of the Netherlands. Did not an example at home render foreign precedents unnecessary?" End quote. Yeah, so actually, the reason that he's saying at the very end part where he says, doesn't the example at home, isn't that good enough, is because in the House of, or in the Senate, or they called it the Congress assembled at the time, before this, in the Articles of Confederation, it wasn't. It was like that, where if you had two representatives per state, if one didn't show up, then like the whole vote didn't count for the state. It was very weird. It was out of whack the way that they had it. Yeah. So in this, what he's really getting at is you would have people just not show up, and then it would be it would be a non-vote. If people just didn't show up, you would have a non-vote on it if you needed 2/3 of the entire body. He thought that 2/3 of whoever was present would actually incentivize more people to show up, and I think he goes on to actually explain that a little bit here. He states next, and I quote, "By making a determinate number at all times requisite to a resolution diminishes the motives to punctual attendance. And as by promoting punctuality it tends to keep the body complete, there is great likelihood that its resolution would generally be dictated by as great a number in this case as in the other, while there would be much fewer occasions of delay." So he's just saying this will incentivize them to show up and be punctual, and we won't have as many delays because of this, because they'll realize that their vote will count. In summation, this provision incentivizes attendance, which in turn allows for the Senate to operate seamlessly with no delay, and most of the senators will be in attendance because of this provision, providing accountability. Yeah, that's another thing. If you decide not to show up to an event like this, then the people in your state are also just going to vote you out, really. So, very last quote that he states. Okay, he states, and I quote, "And when we proceed still one step further and look forward to the probable augmentation of the Senate by the erection of new states, we shall not only perceive ample ground of confidence in the sufficiency of the members to whose agency that power will be entrusted, but we shall probably be led to conclude that a body more numerous than the Senate would be likely to become would be very little fit for the proper discharge of the trust." End quote. So he's saying as we add more states to the Union, we're going to actually have more senators, and they're going to be even more proper and more fit, because the objection was, well, we don't have enough senators, we're laying too much power in the hands of the senators. He says as the country continues to grow and continues to get larger, adds more states to the Union, we're going to have more senators, and that will solve that problem. So that's it for this one, folks. It's pretty short, pretty simple. That concludes it. Next one I have, I think it's the appointing power of the executive. So this actually has to do a little bit, I think, with the nomination of judges, things of that nature. It's going to be very interesting. So ambassadors, public ministers, all that good stuff. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in, as always. Please like, share, subscribe, drop the mic, let people know about the podcast, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.